this is like all of the sci-fi kind of scenarios that I've played out are about to come true.
Today, we're joined by Nita Farahany, a world-renowned scholar at the forefront of exploring how cutting-edge neurotechnology is reshaping our brains, our minds, our laws, and our lives. From her work as a distinguished professor at Duke University to her groundbreaking book, The Battle for Your Brain, she's tackling the big questions about how emerging brain technologies are influencing not just our mental health, but our fundamental freedoms. This is a conversation you don't want to miss.
We haven't hit a like button, but our brain lights up like a like button when we see something. And for companies and employers and governments to have access to that information and the closed loop environment that has been created, where not only do they have access to that information, but they can use it to shape the environment that we're interacting with.
It's exciting and terrifying simultaneously,
It's not hard to start to see how this becomes dystopian pretty quickly if there aren't any limitations on the kinds of data each of these different entities can have access to. In 2018, I was at a conference where one of the co-founders of Control Labs stood up and he was showcasing the technology, and he had it in the form of basically a watch on his wrist. And he, said, why are we humans such clumsy output devices? We're incredibly good at taking in information, but we're really bad at getting it out of our brains. And what if instead of, using these sledgehammer-like devices on the ends of our arms, we just think about typing or swiping instead? And that was the aha moment, where it was both the form factor had been solved by integrating brain sensors into everyday devices like a watch, and the functionality was being addressed in that it was an interface to all of the rest of our technology rather than just a limited application. And I thought, that's it. That's the pivotal acquisition. I'm going to watch that product, because as soon as one of the major tech companies like Apple integrates it into the Apple Watch, all the things I've been following forever are going to go mainstream. And, sure enough, that was the pivotal acquisition. It just happened to be Meta who acquired them a year later.
Yeah, it is so interesting, right? I remember back, unfortunately, I joined you in the Chronic Migraineur Club. So it's been a part of my adult life for as long as I remember. So many people, I have tried so many different things, and there have been all sorts of tech and gadget and things you stuck on your forehead and all the different stuff. But it's interesting. I think what you're referencing also in terms of, one of the really early devices around meditation was this device. I think it was called Muse. I don't know if it's still around or not, where you would put it on. It was sort of like a very sort of like simplified neurofeedback type of thing, which would try and kind of tell you when you're in the zone or not, and help you try and get back there. But it's fascinating that you kind of looked at the world and you said, okay, we're not there yet, but I can see where this is going. And when we hit that tipping point where technology actually is able to do what we wanted to do in a much more sort of commoditized and public and ease-filled and accessible way, it's going to be game on.
Right. That's exactly right. And, and I think because I'd been watching it so long, to your point, I could see what was necessary for the tipping point, and then to see the technology finally come into fruition, to be like, wow, this is all of the sci-fi kind of scenarios that I've played out are about to come true. And, the urgency of it then just became really clear to me. So
maybe let's do a little bit of defining here also, because I'm sure we'll have folks, joining us who are kind of saying, what are you talking about?
Of course.
what actually is this? And we've used the phrase neurotechnology a couple of different times here. If you're explaining this to somebody who's never met you before at dinner, and how would you actually break down? How would you walk somebody through understanding what is neurotechnology the way you talk about it?
Yeah, so the easiest entry point for people is at this point to say, how many of you are wearing a smart device, a smart watch, like an Apple Watch or a smart ring or a Fitbit or any of these other devices that have a sensor in them that are tracking some aspect of your bodily functions, right? It could be the number of steps you take per day. It could be your heart rate. And, at least half the people at your dinner table probably have at least one of those devices on, or that they've, have one in their life that they've acquired. And neurotechnology, at least the way I'm talking about it, isn't what Elon Musk is doing, although we can get into that. It's really taking many of those same devices, whether it's AirPods or a watch, and adding another sensor. And this is a sensor that tracks your brain activity. And it's surprising that those aren't already in our everyday lives, because people are so used to quantifying so many other aspects of their bodily functions. But all this is tracking the brain functions. And most people will say, well, how can you do that? And, it's most of these are tracking what's the electrical activity in your brain. So if you're thinking, if you're listening to this podcast right now, neurons are firing in your brain, giving off tiny electrical discharges. Now that's happening with hundreds of thousands of neurons at the same time, and they give off characteristic patterns that can now be decoded thanks to advances in AI. So you have these different sensors that can pick up that electrical activity. Then you have AI that can interpret what those signals mean. And they can interpret increasingly more thanks to advances in AI and thanks to, massive training of these models on this electrical activity. There are other sensors that are coming too, but the dominant form that most of these devices are integrating are EEG or electroencephalography sensors.
My sense is that, if we were having this conversation a decade ago, this is the type of stuff where you would need to actually have a cap on your head and have, like electrodes, like all over with wires coming out, or potentially go on an fMRI or any of the other sort of like brain-oriented scans to get information. And generally it's only available, either through scientific research, if you're part of a study, or through medical diagnostic and treatment.
Right.
But now it's part of our consumer products.
Yeah. So definitely a decade ago, if you wanted any quality of signal, you would need to have a cap that had, 100 some electrodes on it, and that was applied with gel to your scalp, and it'd be a messy process, and you would just track a short period of time while you're in a doctor's office. Or you go into, your point, like a giant functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and you might be in there for an hour doing an activity, but you'd get a snapshot in time. Those are still going to give you far better signal than any of the consumer devices are, because you're talking about the ability to look more deeply into the brain, or to have, more electrodes covering more of the scalp than these devices. But now, a decade later, you can buy almost, from countless companies now, headphones that have, sensors, maybe 8 in each of the cups, the soft cups that go around your ear, or earbuds that might just have, 4 electrodes in each ear and can detect through the ear what's happening in the electrical activity in your brain, or pick up peripheral nervous system activity. That is, like, as the signals go from your brain down your arm to your wrist, to pick up motor neuron activity at the muscular junctions through something like a watch that has an EMG, electromyography sensor in them. And these are just consumer-based devices, and the major players on the market, like Meta, who acquired that company Control Labs, have started to market these products to, do things like integrate with their Orion augmented reality glasses, or, Apple ProVision that uses eye tracking to make inferences about brain and mental states. They have a patent to put brain sensors into their AirPods, and likewise to put brain sensors into the forehead band of their virtual reality devices to pick up that electrical activity. And so it's no longer something that's confined to the medical arena. And then, of course, the algorithms have gotten much, much better at being able to extract signal over the noisiness of the signal that it's otherwise getting. So the quality has improved for what can actually be detected from brain activity.
I mean, it's just incredible, and it feels like AI over the last couple of years probably just allows the interpretation of like whatever simplified data we're getting from our devices in a way that, probably not too long ago, we would have had really interesting data, but the AI is letting us actually see the utility in it. Like, how do we actually use this to live better and differently?
That's right. And much faster, I think, than anybody expected. When ChatGPT first came out, I reached out to some of the leading neuroscientists and said, like, how are you integrating this already into, language decoding? And they're like, we're figuring it out. We don't totally know yet. It was only a few months later that one of the researchers out of UT Austin published a paper applying GPT-1 to being able to decode information from functional magnetic resonance imaging scanning sessions being able to do things that nobody would have expected, like continuous language, entire paragraphs of what people were thinking being decoded from that, thanks to advances in GPT-1. And when you listen to the conversations at Meta that they've done at MetaConnect, they talk about the power of being able to have like a large language model on a device. One of the limitations of shipping out these products to a mass market has been that everybody's brain signal is a little bit different. And when you have a consumer product, when it comes right out of the box, it needs to work. And so what they've been able to do, thanks to generative AI and having these on-device large language models, is to have basic functionality work right out of the box. Like you can use it to go up, down, left, right, but then it learns you, right? And co-evolves with you and gets better and better at decoding your brain activity by having an on-device decoder and classifier. That's incredible, right? That wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago. And the fact that now these devices can co-evolve to get better and better at decoding brain activity enables a mass market product that couldn't happen before these advances.
Break down what you mean by decoding a little bit more here. Are we talking about literally like wearing a pair of glasses or a watch or earbuds or headphones that can pick up electrical signal in your brain and then literally start to say, oh, this is what you're thinking, this is what you're saying, this is what you're, or like, maybe we're not there yet, but like,
no, I mean, we're through what decoding actually is. But what's tricky is how much it can decode, right? And what it means, what you mean by thinking. So intentional thought or intentional communication is different than passive thought that you have in your brain. Like if I say, I want to send a text message and here's the sentence I want to send, that's intentional communication of speech in your brain. And the devices are getting much better at that, being able to pick up intentional communication of speech and literally what you're thinking, right? So if I want to send a text message and type on a virtual keyboard from what I'm thinking, these models already are starting to be able to do that with pretty amazing accuracy. And then, just think about what a large language model does. It predicts the next word in a sequence. And so, what am I most likely to say? Like open the, is it open the window, open the door, open the wine bottle? You can pick up context to figure out what it is that I'm most likely to say next. And so these models make decoding happen much faster and much more efficiently. Just a few years ago, before the models came onto the market, it was already possible to classify major brain states. So you talked about meditation. Muse has been trying to classify, like, here's roughly what this brain wave means when you're, alpha wave dominant or beta wave dominant, different patterns of electrical activity in the brain. Most likely means you are meditating or you're focusing or you're happy or sad. So those big brain states, are already possible to decode with a decent degree of accuracy using these consumer devices. But it's the ability to decode intentional speech is what has gotten remarkably better. It's even possible to decode passive thinking, though. So that's, I think, where things start to get a little bit scarier for people is the idea of like, can it decode just a story that you're imagining, but that you don't intend to communicate to another person? That's what that first study I was telling you about that came out of UT Austin, it was just stories that people were imagining, not what they were trying to actually communicate. And that, like, they could decode with really high degrees of accuracy using GPT-1. We're already on, 4 Pro, whatever it is, coming, like, approaching 5 very soon, which has only gotten better and being able to do so. And so I think what we're seeing is a move from what had been just general brain state decoding to being able to decode intentional speech, emotions at a much more granular level, and then even just what you're passively thinking rather than actively thinking. And I'll just put in one more caveat, which is, that same researcher, I was having an interesting conversation with him about, like, is this mind reading yet? And, he said,
of course, that's what I'm thinking right now.
Of course, right? Yeah. I mean, I saw that, which is why, of course, I brought it up. I was able to decode what you were thinking, right? So, he said, well, it's interesting because it doesn't, it's decoding what I'm imagining, but not what I feel about what I'm imagining, like the story, right? And he said, like, if you really think about what mind reading is, it's more complex than like one stream. It's it's just like the images that you're, evoking in your mind at the same time as you're thinking about a story or of the words of a story. And then it's how you feel about it. Like there's layers of thought in how you think about it. And I don't think we're at either even, I don't even think that we have an adequate theory of mind to be able to decode all of the complexities of human thought. So it's still sort of a narrow peering into the brain rather than a complete peering into the brain. But it's a much more accurate peering into the brain than I think most people think or thought was possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's so wild. If I understand it correctly, then this sort of like the active thought process and the passive thought process. And the active, I mean, imagine if you're wearing a pair of glasses where, like on the like by your ears, you've got some sensors picking up what's going on in your brain, but you've also, like smart glasses, you've got,
right.
Like some cameras on the front of the glasses and
right.
microphones to pick up
right.
the environment,
right.
so that it can use that to provide context. So it's like it's picking up what's happening inside your brain, but then it's got these external sensors of like vision and auditory to pick up environmental cues to help probably filter into an AI to then interpret and give context and like what is most likely happening here, fill in the blanks. And I would imagine that's going to get more and more accurate as we go.
Well, and I think you raise a great point, right?
Yeah.
Which is we should never really think about these in isolation, right? I mean, if I'm wearing a VR headset, it is packed with sensors. It's got
right.
cameras that are on my face and on my eyes and on the external environment. It has potentially heart rate sensors that are integrated with the Apple Watch that I'm using. It has EEG sensors. And it's all of that that's being used at the same time with complex algorithms to interpret what you're thinking and feeling. And that gives a much more accurate picture, right? It's where you move in the virtual environment. It's the email that you brought up and how you're responding to it. And the kind of contextual ability to take all of that biometric information and all of these other contextual clues means that the power and the accuracy of decoding what you're thinking and feeling goes up exponentially.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I was going with this, right? Because if you add a watch to that, if you add where now you've got like galvanic skin sensors and temperature and heart rate and pulse ox and these things, those are all like indicators of emotional states. Now maybe it's not going to be able to distinguish, are you anxious or excited? Because a lot of times, I guess maybe it'll tease it out, and maybe it can actually overlay that with what you're thinking to actually then determine, is this physiological response more likely to be anxiety or excitement? It's wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I mean, more importantly, it's not even just, are you anxious or excited? It's, what are you anxious or excited about?
Yeah.
Right. And then how, what are you envisioning and what are you visualizing at the same time? And, and then, even more provocatively, and if whoever or whatever entity is monitoring the fact that you're anxious or excited, is it possible to change how you feel rather than to just, allow you to continue to be anxious and excited?
Yeah. And I want to get to a lot of sort of like those more complicated use cases. But before we get there, I also want to explore, what are the big benefits of being able to do this on a personal level, on a societal level? What comes to mind immediately is, are there benefits on a mental health level of being able to actually harness these tools?
Well, I mean, to your point, you've tried every device, just like I've tried every device with respect to migraine, right? And if you are a chronic migraine sufferer, you understand that it is debilitating, it is painful, and it's frustrating because, every treatment is inadequate in some way and has some side effect to it. And if there's just some magical thing that I could do to just, stimulate my brain and make the pain go away or to stop the migraine in its tracks, I absolutely would. That's true for a lot of mental health conditions and to neurological conditions. And it's just an incredibly undertreated area and poorly understood area. So what's happening, in the space of neurological disease and suffering up until now has been incredibly poorly characterized and undertreated. So, consider the fact that like already people with epileptic seizure, especially those who are treatment resistant, one of the big breakthroughs of monitoring for brain activity has been the ability to use algorithms to predict minutes to up to an hour before a person suffers from the epileptic seizure. And for somebody who's treatment resistant, they could take just-in-time medication or get a just-in-time alert to be in a place of safety. That's, a game changer. I would like to have that same kind of notification of when I'm going to have a migraine and be able to, kind of address my life accordingly. I don't know if you get aura or visual disturbances, but I do. And it can be, frightening while you're driving suddenly to have, stars running across your visual space. Likewise, that areas like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, it's possible to diagnose a lot earlier using neurotechnology. One of the really exciting studies that I saw looked at glioblastoma, which is, one of the most frightening brain cancers for people when they are diagnosed with it, because it's such a pervasive kind of brain cancer. By the time it's been diagnosed, it's almost always, spread throughout the brain, and the tangles of it make it incredibly difficult to fully resect. And so it's a really lethal diagnosis for many people. There are early electrical changes that happen in the brain that are possible to detect with continuous use. And so just like people are tracking heart rate and seeing if they, are suffering from abnormal like arrhythmias or having atrial fibrillation or something, and then using that for information, being able to track your brain health in the same way, whether that's, the earliest electrical changes, be it, suggesting something like glioblastoma or disturbances in sleep that need to be addressed. And sleep is so important to mental health and well-being and, staving off all kinds of diseases, to even things like we live in such a distracted world now, right? Like our technology is designed to make it so that we can't have sustained attention. Being able to use technology to see that, to visualize it, and then to be able to use it to try to improve your focus and attention, there's a lot of promise here. So I'd say it goes from the most serious conditions for neurological disease and suffering, or with implanted neurotechnology. There are reports of, one patient who had their brain to spine reconnected through a device, or, patients who have lost the ability to communicate verbally, being able to, with implanted neurotechnology, do so, and in the future with wearable neurotechnology, do so. I'm really bullish. You can tell there's so many promising health cases and so many promising just well-being cases for it, that for me, I'm, net optimistic if we can get it right.
What about on the mental health side? Because what I'm wondering is, we have such an epidemic of depression and anxiety, and it's still, just so poorly treated and understood. I mean, there are great advances. There's amazing things happening, but for sure, the prevalence of this and the misery that it causes, the level of suffering that it causes, is so pervasive and so deep now. And I'm wondering whether you see any sort of form of neurotech out there that might help in that context.
Yeah. So I know less on the anxiety front for really good neurotech devices. I know more on the anxiety side on basic biofeedback. Like there's some really cool platforms like Mightier, which are designed for kids to, follow heart rate and to be able to see when their heart rate is getting elevated, and then learn ways in playing the game to be able to bring their heart rate down, and techniques for being able to decrease the anxiety. I suspect that those platforms will get better and better with neurofeedback. But on the depression side, I know more advances that have been really promising in this regard. So for both and for any mental health issue, I'd say, again, they're poorly characterized. We group a bunch of things together symptomatically, even though the underlying neural mechanisms might be quite different. And the more data that we have of people using everyday devices in everyday settings rather than a snapshot in a doctor's office will give us the ability to learn a lot more. But there's, two examples already in depression where treatment has improved thanks to neurotechnology. One of them is there was a company that was using neural stimulation And they'd been using it for performance enhancement for a while and didn't have a big market in it. They ended up partnering with a company that has since run it through clinical trials and is marketing it primarily in Europe called Flow Neuroscience, where it's been shown to substantially improve depression symptoms by this neuromodulation, which is, I think, pretty cool. And then the second is there's a company that already has an FDA-approved device for Parkinson's and for essential tremor. What they do is they track neural signals as they go from the brain down the arm to the wrist. And if you think about tremor, where like oftentimes it's one side, they don't have a lot of other symptoms yet in early, Parkinson's or an essential tremor, it's just a one-sided tremor. It picks up that neural signature and then it sends back an inhibitory response to the brain and stops the tremor. And that same company has been investigating for depression and other mental health conditions, whether they can decode, again, the precise neural patterns and then send feedback that would interfere with that. We've seen in implanted neurotechnology that being truly transformative for patients who suffer from depression, especially intractable depression. And to be able to do it with a wearable device, I think is incredibly exciting. So they have some of those in clinical trial right now for mental health conditions, including depression. And I'm really excited about that because, with essential tremor, part of the reason that drugs don't work is because they're incredibly nonspecific. It's like bathing the entire brain to try to get at one problem, right? Whereas you can pick up a precise neural pattern and send a response that interferes with it. And with depression and with other mental health conditions, the more you can precisely track what's happening and then more precisely target it rather than bathing the entire brain with a whole bunch of side effects, these are really promising and exciting advances for those areas.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. I'm curious, would you consider something like TMS to fall under this umbrella? I know there was sort of like the first wave of it, and then Stanford, I guess a couple of years ago, came out with a newer, the same protocol, a different approach to this, where like you can literally use electromagnetic stimulation to have some pretty profound effects on depression.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you ever tried the TMS for migraine. I did. So they had this like big helmet you could get at home, and you'd get like a certain number of pulses that you could use, and it was really cumbersome. I was unable to do it. So yes to TMS. I classify under neurotechnology really any device that like interfaces directly with the central or peripheral nervous system. It's a very broad set of technologies, but TMS, transcranial direct current stimulation, ECT, the electric shock kind of treatments, those are all like in many ways first generation technologies in this space that are getting better and better as we study and understand. I shouldn't say we, I'm not one of the neuroscientists, right? I'm studying the neuroscientists, but as neuroscientists really study and understand what the effects of those are and then make them increasingly more precise. Because, one of the things that was exciting about transcranial magnetic stimulation is you could look into the brain, figure out a specific spot, and then direct the pulse to it. But for the most part, that had to happen in like a clinic. And, they're not like sustained treatments that, every time you're experiencing it, you go in and, get a pulse that happens. And so, what the promise of a lot of these neurotechnologies is being able to move from the clinic, from the hospital, from the doctor's office into everyday settings to have portable, wearable technology that offers much more precise and targeted treatment.
Yeah, it's so exciting. One of the things that's popping into my head around this also, though, is there so here's the analogy. Over the last couple of years, whole body MRIs have become sort of like this topic of conversation. Anyone can show up. You don't need a script from your doctor. You pay a couple $1,000s and you get, spend an hour in an MRI and they'll give you this report. And what a lot of people are doing with them is they're trying to actually see if they can pick up really early stage cancer in their bodies. And there is a contingent in the medical world that is pushing back aggressively against this, saying you're going to get a whole bunch of false positives, and B, a lot of what may get picked up is never going to go anywhere. Nothing's going to happen to it. So you're going to start to flood the medical system, which is already overwhelmed with people where they're using technology in incredible settings. And some of them will detect things which are incredible. Now you can stop something before it actually becomes really harmful. But the concern is, are you going to, if this becomes something that happens at scale, are you going to start to flood the medical provider system with all these people inquiring into and running, like a metric ton of additional tests and stuff like this, that end up actually not being necessary or useful. So I'm curious whether you see that potential with what we're talking about in neurotech.
Yeah, it's funny. Doctors seem to hate every step toward personalized medicine. Like you have more autonomous patients.
Yeah. By the way, that wasn't me making that argument.
No,
because
I know.
I don't necessarily agree with that, but
yeah.
it's an argument that I've heard a number of times now.
Yeah, I hear it all the time, right? And I've heard it in kind of every different context. So 23andMe, when they launched the direct-to-consumer, genetic testing, doctors like, now everybody's going to come in. We don't know have any idea how to interpret any of this. And they're all going to be convinced that they have a predisposition for X, Y, and Z, and it's going to flood the medical system. Well, I mean, it is true that patients would go in with their, 23andMe reports, and the doctor would say, I have no idea how to interpret that, and I'm not going to order a bunch of tests for you. But the idea that one of the early arguments in that space was that women were going to come in asking for preemptive double mastectomies based on what their 23andMe report showed. That didn't happen. But, if it was a well-informed patient who went in and said, hey, this showed that I have the breast cancer genes, my mom and my grandmother died of breast cancer, I'd like to run the test because we haven't tested, with medical grade testing. And if it's positive, I want to have a double mastectomy. That's okay. I mean, I actually think that's a good informed patient. Yes, it's an increased number of patients, but it's essentially an increased number of patients who are saved as opposed to just an increased number of patients. And what hasn't happened is in each of these other areas, the same arguments were being made about the Apple Watch. Doctors were opposed to, giving patients the capability of having the EKGs on the watches. And, there's going to be abnormal heart rhythms and all kinds of patients who are flooding the system. No, but, there are earlier detection and more detection of heart disease. And there is, very low false positive rate, but there is some false positive. And yet there are also positive cases that it's catching and saving lives. And so, I think the medical system has to be open to a changing world of technology where patients are more empowered and getting more and more information where they can make decisions about their own lives and that they might be more in the driver's seat of those decisions. The MRI case is a tricky one. And the reason it's a tricky one is we don't have routine scanning data for patients to know what those scans mean, right? And so it's the validation that's the problem, which is, being able to interpret a scan when there is no baseline set of healthy individuals who have MRI scans to know what's the rate at which these things progress, if they progress at all. Does that finding actually mean anything clinically significant? And so it's harder when you have unvalidated studies like those, and we don't have a basis to be able to study. What I hope is that a lot of those early MRI scans will become part of a data set so that we can track them over time, and that we more systematically start, you've got to compare the different machines that they're on. They've got to be capturing the data in a way that could actually allow for longitudinal studies of them so that in time they'll become useful. But I haven't rushed out to get one of those MRIs largely because we just don't know what the early scans mean in a lot of these instances. And, my blood tests are fine. All the other indicators of kind of early, the other early indicators and scans that you might do are fine. But my sister did. She went out and got the full body MRI, and, she and her partner both did it and are making lifestyle choices based on what they found. So,
yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating moment. I actually know somebody who did it and detected, thought they were completely healthy and nothing was going on. They detected stage 1 or even less than stage 1 pancreatic cancer and had a very fast and easy treatment and was basically said, you're good.
Yeah.
And you realize that, especially with cancer, that so often it's not the fact that it's there, it's the stage that it's caught that becomes.
That's right. That's right. And that's why my sister did it. She was like, okay, maybe there will be a bunch of, kind of unknown significant findings. But if there is a significance finding that we know of and we see it, I'd rather have the scan and be able to address it. I think that's a fair point. I think, doctors are worried more about the findings of unknown significance rather than the findings of known significance on those scans.
Right, something clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we think about neurotech then, like in all these different use cases and technologies we're talking about, it feels like we can also kind of like split this into, okay, so there's on the one side, there's the sensing element of it.
Uh-huh.
And then for some, it seems like there's starting to be also and sort of like an intervention side of it too. It's like, so first we pick up something that's like, ooh, this is a signal that something's a little bit off here. And then we have some technology, maybe it's the same, maybe it's a different tech that can then influence the connection between the brain and the body to actually in some way intervene or help with whatever it is that you're moving through. As we start to sort of like zoom the lens out a bit, all of these technologies, and this is something you speak and write about regularly, they tend to not be the type of technologies where you buy it and then everything that gets sensed and intervened just stays with you.
Right. Yeah.
And this is where we start to get into really murky water. So take me into this.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we've talked through, there are huge benefits to individual access to this technology or even sharing the data with your doctor. The upside potential is really quite enormous. But, in order to capture data about what's happening in my brain, I have to have that data go from my brain somewhere else, right? That is, something has to detect it, and then it has to communicate with something like my iPhone and an app that's on my iPhone. And then from there, the big question is what happens next, right? Does a company suddenly have access to that data? Does my employer, if it's a work-issued, phone, have access to brain data? Does the government, in the same way that they have subpoenaed all kinds of, personal data from phones and from Apple Watches and other devices, suddenly have the right in a criminal case or in a civil case to, be able to get access to that data and to be able to use it against me in different settings? So, what we've seen in the digital era is that all of these different technologies, which we, purportedly receive for free or for really subsidized costs, aren't free to us, that the product is us, and that the collection of the data and the use of that data and the reselling of that data or the use of that data to steer our behavior or to keep us addicted to devices is primarily how the companies have monetized the products that they're selling to us. And brain data, I believe, and many others too, that it's uniquely sensitive. It's the kind of pre-behavioral information. It's the information we haven't shared. We haven't hit a like button, but our brain lights up like a like button when we see something. And for companies and employers and governments to have access to that information and the closed loop environment that has been created, where not only do they have access to that information, but they can use it to shape the environment that we're interacting with, it can go dystopian incredibly quickly. And so, what I really have been writing about and speaking about is this is technology that, we shouldn't be trying to ban. That's not the answer, but that we have to steer in a way where we're not afraid of the misuse of this. It doesn't become the most Orwellian technology we've ever introduced into society, that we get the upside potential and we mitigate against the downside risk by putting into place safeguards now before it becomes in every pair of headphones you wear, in every AirPod, and every watch, and every VR and AR device that you don.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also, right? Because I would imagine we'll get to a point fairly soon where a lot of the devices that we buy just for our own convenience have this technology in it.
Yep.
We didn't buy it because of that. We may not be aware of the fact that it actually has this capability in it because we're not really, quote, using that for our own benefit.
Right.
But the sensors are there. It's detecting and decoding potentially in the background. And the question is like, are we okay with that? And are we, and what is, even if we have no interest in that information, we're not using it in a meaningful way, if that's happening, and then that's being passed outside of our immediate ecosystem or device, are we aware of that? Are we okay with it? And I'm not aware of a lot of conversation happening around this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. Now, I think, many of the companies will start by marketing much more directly to say, like, it has these capabilities and that's why you're buying it. But if the next generation of AirPods is packed with sensors, and some of those sensors are brain sensing sensors, and you can either choose to interact with that on your health app or not, but it's still collecting the data all the same, or, you buy a virtual reality headset and the way that you navigate, through the game is by thinking about it, but you're not thinking about what that actually means about how leaky your brain is now with respect to the data that can be gathered about it. Should we have much more explicit consent? Should we have much more explicit notice to people? And should there be different ways that different categories of data are treated, right? You might be fine. And a lot of my students, they, when I ask them how they feel about personalized algorithms that, figure out what they like, for the most part, they seem to be fine with it. They're like, okay, you have to collect a huge amount of data for me, but are you giving me products that I actually like? And am I seeing fewer that I don't? Great. My feed is more, specialized to me. I'm okay with that. It's what that data enables in ways that are frightening or problematic. And, some of the examples I go into in the book, like in China, there's already educational classrooms where the students are required to wear brain sensing headsets that track their focus and attention. That data is given to the teachers, it's given to the parents, it's given to the states, and they've been punished for, what their brain metrics reveal. And just, imagine being in an autocratic regime where you're a child and your brain activity is being monitored, the entire day that you're in the classroom. What does that do to your ability to think freely, to, develop and grow in the way that a child should be able to develop and grow? Or in the workplace where, people are increasingly used to surveillance of, their productivity tools on their laptops, but suddenly your brain sensing earbuds are also something that your employer has access to, and the kind of informational asymmetry that creates, or the increased pressure that creates to stay, focused and paying attention the entire day, even if that's not the best thing for you or for the bottom line, or they start to see decline in mental health. And what do they do with that information? Or if health insurance companies have access to that information, your car insurance company has access to the information, right? Like, it's not hard to start to see how this becomes dystopian pretty quickly if there aren't any limitations on the kinds of data each of these different entities can have access to. And nothing really prevents these companies from selling your data to all of those third parties. There's a couple of states in the US that have started to move in the direction of adopting laws that protect neural data. And there's some international treaties and accords that are underway. But, it's largely the Wild West when it comes to brain data.
Again, it's exciting and terrifying simultaneously. It will enable so much. And at the same time, it just opens so many questions. The notion of, the typical person. I remember hearing some data about, like the types of thoughts that a typical, just normal everyday person, well-adjusted, great life, and yet that typical person is also going to have some pretty warped and pretty dark thoughts, like here and there, and sometimes more here and there. They'll never do anything about it. They'll never act on it. But it's actually, and they may actually feel like, well, that's kind of weird and dark, not realizing that actually the vast majority of people have those same types of thoughts, like that pass in and out, and will never do anything about it. It's just sort of like part of the human condition, But if those thoughts register, like if you're hanging out wearing your smart glasses and just walking around, those thoughts register, and then that information can get passed on to other people. Like, does that then raise red flags with, potential partners, potential employers, potential, like somebody wants to, is considering you as a student in a university, and they have, they look at your application, and then like they have their neural data that gets passed to them also to try and make sure that we have a safe class. On the one hand, yes, we all want safety and we want ease, we want the best. But at the same time, if you start to just judge people on what are, quote, aberrant but everyday and very common thoughts that happen in a brain, it gets really spooky.
Yeah, I mean, you raise so many interesting points within that, right? From the misclassification of neuroatypicality, right? I mean, all of us have thoughts that, like a good example that I give every now and then, I just think like, okay, I'm going to strangle my husband, right? I don't really think that, right? I'm never going to actually act on that, but I don't have always, just kind and lovely thoughts about my husband every single day and every single second of every day. And you can just imagine for yourself the thoughts that you have. Somebody walks by, you have an unkind thought, like whatever it is. We're not always proud of every thought that pops into our head, but it's our actions that we want to be judged on, not every thought that pops into our heads. And yet we could quickly get to this world where we're judging people based on their thoughts. And that's not so unbelievable, right? If you already look, like I talk about this in my chapter on your brain at work, there's already companies that are doing personality and cognitive and neural testing based on neuroscience for screening and for hiring candidates in the workplace. And, the theories that they're built on are all based on trying to, typify how your brain works. And, that together with a device that's put onto your head or eye tracking data that's making inferences about what's happening in your brain as you're answering those questions, this is all within the realm of what's already happening. And so, given how afraid we all are, I'm a parent, I worry every day when my kids go to school with all of the school shootings. Is it really so far-fetched for us to think that there's going to start to be increased screenings for people for safety and that we start to label people particular ways? There's a researcher by the name of Kent Keel who for a long time has been studying psychopaths and has been characterizing their brain activity and came out with some really controversial findings a few years back where he showed that the differences he sees in brain scans in psychopaths who are in jail, he can start to see those differences as early as 5 years old. Now, he hasn't followed those 5-year-olds to adulthood to see if they end up in prison, but it's not hard to imagine people taking that kind of research and applying it to say, okay, we have an incredibly competitive and selective process for this private school. You have to submit this kind of data for us to see, are you a danger to our classroom community?
Or are you the, quote, type of student that would thrive in this environment, which brings in all sorts of opportunity for bias and all sorts of other stuff. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, right, is that it's the coded bias that can happen in this space, right? It's like nobody's going to tell you that the reason that they didn't bring you in or hire you or that they fired you was because of what your brain metrics showed. Instead, they're going to say you weren't the right fit, you weren't being as productive as you should be, we're just having structured layoffs, like whatever it is, even though they're using this data to make those kinds of decisions.
And then on the other side, there may be some real value for somebody to actually be using data like this for both people. Like maybe you actually figure out we actually legitimately are not a type of fit for the type of opportunity that this is and just the way that your brain functions.
Or optimistically, there's all kinds of brain wellness programs that companies have implemented. So instead of using it to penalize people or to invade on their mental privacy, you actually use it to provide more services that help people who are struggling with stress or struggling with mental health to be able to have the resources they need to get treatment and to be able to, regain the kind of self-determination over their lives that they might want.
Yeah. I mean, maybe somebody you're able to actually pick up, you have some young employee there who's just pushing and working nonstop and they're being told don't do this. We don't expect this of you, but the script in their brain is this is how I get ahead.
Right.
And you can start to actually detect maybe this person is tipping towards mental illness or burnout or something like this. And we need to intervene because we need to help them because they're not helping themselves.
Well, in fact, I get into some of those use cases in the book where I talk about cognitive load and overload that already, the future of a more positive workplace could be one in which you can actually detect cognitive overload, which has been, attributed to not just stress and mental health, concerns for the individual, but also safety, right? Their own safety and the safety of the others that they're working around, and to be able to say oop, you are reaching cognitive overload. There's a new company, a company that's just launched their headphones that have EEG sensors. And one of the features that they've enabled in the app is to give you a signal when you're reaching a level of overload, when it's time for you to take a brain break, both to be able to recover, but to get to levels of optimal productivity and to optimal levels of, the right balance of stress versus, kind of drive versus burnout. And I think those are really positive possible use cases of being able to give you the feedback that you need that you're not getting internally from yourself, about, hey, it's time for a break. This is the best thing for you to actually achieve the goals that you want to achieve.
So where do we go with all of this? Where there's a really clear acceleration in the technology and what it's able to do. There are a lot of really interesting and fascinating benefits, maybe even life-saving or life-changing benefits. There are some real big concerns about what happens with all of the data that comes out of these. What's the way forward right now? Like, if you look at the next 3-5 years, what would you want to see happen?
So first and foremost, I think we have to put into place a recognition of basic rights for individuals to flip the narrative to empower people. And those are rights around what I call cognitive liberty, the right to self-determination over your brain and mental experiences. And from a human rights perspective, that looks like trying to secure to people a right to privacy, which would include a right to mental privacy, a right to self-determination, which gives you both a right to access and change your brain if you choose to do so, and a right to freedom of thought to protect you against interception, manipulation, and punishment of your thoughts. On the other side, we have to shore up the capacities for cognitive liberty, being able to help people navigate an increasingly noisy world. So these are things like really starting to develop our interoceptive capabilities, our mental agility, and our relational intelligence so that we can navigate this world and be able to use the freedoms that are being protected by cognitive liberty by having the capacities that we need to be able to navigate the world, to be able to think critically, to be able to think freely, and to engage with technologies in ways that are intentional and productive for us. So, that looks like educational changes that we need to put into place. It looks like practices in our everyday lives to be able to create this better mind-body connection that we're losing because of the way technology is being developed and designed. And so I think there's a lot that needs to happen at the individual level, and there's a lot that needs to happen at the societal level to bridge the gap of where we are right now versus where we need to go.
Yeah. Are you bullish on the policy level?
Bullish, not at this moment in time. I think that, I think the U.S. is going into a period where we're going to see is, an experiment with much more laissez-faire engagement with technology. What we see as early indicators of how technology companies are reacting to that is really to push all of the obligations to individuals rather than providing any protections to them. And, companies up until now have been monetizing all of our data and have done so without any, kind of oversight. The EU is moving in a very different direction of trying to put into place much stricter safeguards, and that could end up serving as a floor that companies have to, adopt as certain protections to be able to not have to navigate different markets incredibly differently. But what I see is kind of a unrestricted race by technology companies without a lot of intervention by governments to try to put into place the right sticks or the right incentives to realign that technology with human flourishing. So I'm not that bullish in the exact moment that we're talking, but I also feel like if I don't maintain optimism, it's hard for me to do the work that I do, which is to continue to advocate for the changes we need to put into place. The one thing that gives me a sliver of optimism is that the few states and countries that have adopted specific protections around brain and mental experiences have done so in a bipartisan fashion. They seem to recognize the exceptional nature of being able to peer into and to change our brains. And so it gives me some optimism that at least in this one space, there is a concern. Like, imagine being a politician, being able to have all of your thoughts read. That would be really bad for them, right? So they sort of get that there needs to be some protections in this space. And so that gives me a good sliver of hope to keep working on.
I mean, that makes so much sense. It's like if you see this technology and you're like, this would help me do X, Y, or perform at this level, or like just live so much better, more comfortably. But it also potentially exposes me, but I really, really, really want the benefit of that. Then there will be an incentive to say I want to be able to access this, but we need to be able to protect against the dark side, the downside here. It's just such a fascinating moment.
Yeah.
Feels like a good place for us to come full circle in our conversation as well. So in this Container of Good Life project, if I offer up the phrase to live a good life, what comes up?
It's to live a life of purpose and meaning. And I think, increasingly as I write in this space, I find that it's not a destination, right? It's about the journey itself. And the more we can do to enable people on that journey to do so freely, to be able to do so with intentionality, and to be able to do so with their full capacities, I think the more likely that we can live a good life individually and collectively.
Thank you. If you haven't yet subscribed to the show, it would mean the world to me if you took just 2 seconds to tap on that subscribe button. It helps us grow our Good Life Project community and continue creating the best possible show that we can for you. And it ensures you'll never miss an episode.